I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us online for Henley & Partners' 16th Annual Global Citizenship Conference. My name's Juliet Foster, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists for this next session, which is focused on millionaires on the move, the private wealth migration trends that we can expect in 2023. Joining me online is Misha, Glenny, the award-winning financial journalist and author, Andrew Amoils, who's the head of research at New World Wealth, and Dominic, Volek, the group head of private clients at Henley & Partners. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Misha, Glenny, let me start first with you. So much is happening in the world at the moment, but how are geopolitics shaping the movement of private wealth and, of course, wealthy individuals?
Well, geopolitics has had a huge impact on this in the past year. First of all, we have to remember that there was the pandemic from 2020 to 2021, and there a lot of movement, global movement, either of individuals or of wealth, came to a bit of a grinding halt. But since then, things have become very dramatic. Most notable has been the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, of course, on February the 24th of this year. And this led to a significant flight of capital out of the United Kingdom and Europe and the United States back into Russia, because President Putin basically said to his oligarchs, the people who hold up his regime with their economic power, you have to come back and you have to support the war effort. So they were given a choice, either stay in the West or go back to Russia, and most of them chose to go back to Russia. A lot of their assets have been frozen. The other major geopolitical event, which has been bubbling over the past 5 to 6 years, which is leading to people moving their money around, is the increasing competition between China and the United States. So you've seen a certain flight of capital from China, particularly after the crackdown in Hong Kong by the Chinese government. Wealthy people felt that this was not as secure a place to hold their money as they had done before. Those were both Chinese nationals and others. So with the increasing competition between the West and East Asia, and to an extent South America and Africa as well, you have seen people revise their investment decisions. You've seen people revise their decisions of where they want to live. So there's been a lot of movement going on. And of course, there is a lot to come, because we don't know what the outcomes of these various crises and conflicts are going to be.
Is it possible to quantify how much wealth is being moved around and how much has been lost, or perhaps the value eroded as a result of conflict, or indeed the imposition of sanctions?
The only area where we can start to get some sense of what's happening is with Russian wealth in Europe. So we've had literally, and the United States, I beg your pardon, we've had literally hundreds of billions of dollars of assets which have been frozen. Some of them are still accessible to the Russian wealthy, because they have them in trusts or they're held by other people for them. But some of them have clearly been very badly hit by this. We know of a couple of cases in the United Kingdom, Piotr Aven and Michael Friedman, who live in London and now claim that they cannot access any of their money. They're allowed, it turns out, to have £60,000 a month in order to live. But no, we don't yet know the extent of how the sanctions have impacted, because there are secondary sanctions. A lot of wealthy Chinese and Indians have stopped trading with Russia and moved their money out of Russia, and it's very difficult for us to quantify where this money is going and why.
What are the wealthy doing to protect those assets which perhaps can be defined as immovable, and by nature of that makes them a very easy target for hostile governments? And how far can those protective steps actually work?
Well, a lot of wealthy people are looking at places that they feel are safe from crises. It's been known for a while, for example, that a lot of money has been invested in New Zealand because it seems far enough away from all of these crises. It's a very beautiful place to live. And so New Zealand has benefited considerably from this. The United Arab Emirates, as always, a safe bet. Quite a lot of money has gone in there. You have seen some money leave Brazil and move into Europe because of the uncertainty surrounding the politics in Brazil. Of course, we've just seen Lula da Silva has just been re-elected as president, but it's very tense in Brazil because Jair Bolsonaro, his predecessor, has not conceded. And so there's been a fair measure of a fair movement of capital out of Brazil into countries like Italy and Portugal, with which Brazil has good relations. It's very, very uncertain at the moment because you're seeing crises pop up everywhere, but there are still a lot of places which are safe. The United States has benefited enormously from this. There's been a big movement of capital into the United States, partly because the United States is economically so stable at the moment relative to the European countries and the United Kingdom.
Andrew, we heard Misha mentioning there some of the countries where millionaires are going. But how far backwards are governments prepared to bend in order to accommodate them, to make them attractive? What is it that they're offering that perhaps other governments aren't doing?
Well, I think there's the usual pull factors around safety and things like that. And obviously business opportunities, taxation is sometimes a factor as well. And in the case of places like Australia, their whole immigration system is really catered towards getting professional people or people that are relatively wealthy if they're older. So I guess their whole immigration system is geared towards encouraging wealthy people to move there. And obviously a lot of countries that attract wealthy people have investor visa programs and residency programs that encourage wealthy people to move. But most of the wealthy people that move are not actually moving through those programs. They're moving through the usual mechanisms like work visas, family visas, etc.
Now, you recently wrote in an article that Russia is losing its millionaires, and I'm fascinated by the context in which that remark was made. Does it perhaps point to a major economic collapse in the not too distant future precisely because of this outflow of capital?
There's already been what one could say is a collapse economically in Russia over the last few years in any case, in terms of wealth destruction. So I suppose it's difficult to say whether if it's going to get worse now, but certainly there hasn't been much wealth growth. If you look in terms of US dollar terms, there's been about negative wealth growth over the last decade in Russia of about negative 30%. So they've already lost a lot of wealth. But it is an interesting thing to look at because there are countries, when you look at, I'm in South Africa, and in Zimbabwe, there was an economic collapse in around 2001. And a lot of wealthy people did leave in the late 90s. So that was probably a sign of trouble. In the case of Russia, I think it's probably, the damage has been done to an extent, but yeah, it could certainly get worse.
And let's focus on those places where the very wealthy are migrating to, places like Australia, Switzerland, Portugal, and of course, the UAE. These are currently very popular locations amongst migrating millionaires. But why now? What is it about these countries which is making them stand out at this particular juncture of time?
In the case of the UAE, it's the top safe haven in that part of the world. So that whole North Africa, Middle East, South Asia area, they are the main safe haven in that area. And they are a relatively safe country compared to the other countries in the region. They're probably not that safe compared to places in Europe, though, but compared to the places in their region, they are. And they obviously got tax benefits, and they are very appealing in terms of luxury offerings and things like that. In the case of Australia, as I mentioned earlier, its entire immigration system is really geared towards attracting wealthy people, but it does offer a lot of benefits as well. Obviously, it's got very good climate, lifestyle. It's one of the 10 biggest wealth markets in the world in terms of total wealth. It's got a very good healthcare system, probably the best public healthcare system in the world. And it's actually, in terms of taxes, it's not as bad as some people think, because there's no estate duty in Australia. So they do have relatively high income tax rates, but there actually is no estate duty. So that probably sets it apart from pretty much every other first world country in the world. So yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why Australia is attractive. In terms of Portugal, it's also a very safe country, and it's got a very well-known investor visa program, and it's very popular in terms of beachfront properties for wealthy people and the lifestyle. And in terms of Switzerland, well, Switzerland's always been a hub for wealthy people in terms of migration. There's a number of factors there. It's obviously the biggest wealth management hub in the world, so a lot of wealthy people have always had their money there. And as time's gone on, a lot of those wealthy people have probably moved there as a result. And it's obviously a very safe country as well.
Dominic, come into the conversation. What do these patterns tell you about current migration trends? And how do they compare perhaps to an identical period during the COVID-19 lockdown, when most of us were under lock and key, but clearly some people were still able to move?
We expect to see a lot more sort of millionaire migration, particularly in 2023. Of course, with COVID, it wasn't physically possible for people to move around the world. So there was an initial slowdown, particularly in sort of interest in the various investment migration programs that are available around the world. But once sort of things started to settle down, we saw increased interest, and historically, a lot of our clients have not physically relocated after having successfully participated in an investment migration program. But there's certainly a trend where people are becoming a bit more mobile. And as I said, 2023 is expected to see the largest number of millionaires moving around the world. Some countries are benefiting, some countries are losing, of course, which Andrew has spoken to. But we expect that trend to continue going into the next couple of years.
But apart from the volatility that arises from conflict, what are the other motivators that are encouraging the wealthy to actually migrate? Are they factoring into that decision access to good healthcare, or perhaps the perception that their own civil liberties are in some way endangered?
There's a lot of reasons why our clients come to us and consider, whether it's a residence by investment program or a citizenship by investment program. Traditionally, the industry has largely been driven out of emerging markets, where perhaps they were born in a country where the passport was quite limited in terms of their global mobility and their travel freedom and their visa-free access to key markets, whether it was for business or for sort of leisure purposes. That is still there, and particularly as sort of lockdowns have eased and people can now start to move around the world, regardless of the soaring flight prices. But people are certainly becoming more mobile, and that requirement of potentially having a better travel document by owning a second passport that gives better visa-free access to key markets, that is still there. And so we still see a lot of demand out of the emerging markets like the Philippines and Bangladesh and South Africa and Nigeria. But of course, the motives have also changed. And as you mentioned, healthcare, we do see, particularly from those that are looking at using investment migration and following up that with an actual physical relocation, then of course, healthcare is right at the forefront, as well as education opportunities. COVID, of course, enhanced that discussion around pandemic preparedness, pandemic response. How did ICU beds handle certain demand in certain countries? So healthcare has become a big factor. And one sort of big trend we've seen coming out of COVID, or almost coming out of COVID, is the demand from, sort of more tier one countries, such as the US and the UK and Canada, a lot more interest out of Australia, really just looking for greater optionality. And so if you take the Americans as an example, they're traditionally not a real sort of hotbed of demand for investment migration. But during the lockdown period, and particularly in the initial stages, if you're a wealthy American, you could not enter Europe. They banned, citizens or residents of the US from entering. And so wealthy people did not like that. And so they're all about optionality and diversification. And so that saw the initial spike out of the US. And then, of course, as you mentioned, from a geopolitical perspective, that also drives a lot of the demand. So there's a wider range of factors why people consider investment migration and possibly relocating, and gone are the days where it was just about getting a better travel document.
And let me take it back to geopolitics, because yes, we are operating in an uncertain background, but at the same time, for a very wealthy person, there's a lot of challenge as well, because there are no guarantees that you can go to a country which looks economically or politically stable, and that framework will persist. Things could always change. There is the potential for a curveball to upend things.
Exactly. And of course, we live in a more and more volatile world. And so this really drives the sort of second big trend that we see, which is clients really now understanding the necessity of having a portfolio of residence or citizenship options available to them, because the situation in Ukraine is the classic example at the moment. So Europe was never a particularly hotbed of demand for investment migration. But now if you're living in Europe and all you have is let's say a German passport and German residence, but you have this happening on your doorstep, we get a lot of inquiries about, well, what options are available in the Southern Hemisphere. So as Misha mentioned, Australia and New Zealand are very far away, and that's quite an attractive aspect to those options now. But, countries like Panama, Mauritius, they all have investment migration programs. So I think people are realizing that, well, they've always known about diversifying their asset classes and what I invest into. But if you have the financial capacity and the ability to hold a second or third citizenship and multiple residences, you really need to have that in place now, because things change. And of course, high net worth individuals don't plan for the next 3 to 5 years. They plan for the next 5, 6, 7 generations. And so this has become another big trend that we've seen is individuals realizing to have as diversified sort of geographical options and places to go, whether it's for the short term or the long term.
Sadly, we have to leave things there, but thank you all for your time and, of course, your valuable contributions to this session of Henley & Partners' 16th Annual Global Citizenship Conference, in what has been a fascinating look into the crystal ball of private wealth migration trends for 2023. A big thank you as well to our global online audience. We appreciate your interest and your engagement.